Good evening and welcome to On the Road Part 4. Tonight I'm in Sedgefield, Tony Blair's old constituency. Tony Blair, who of course wants a second referendum, now represented by his former agent, who is a fanatical Remainer wanting a second referendum, which of course is now Labour Party policy. And isn't it funny? All over this part of England, we have Labour seats that voted heavily Leave, who are represented by Remainer MPs. So I was in Hartlepool earlier on today, and as you may well have caught up with, we did our national strategy launch. And I want to explain that to you here this evening on the Road. This has not been easy the last couple of weeks. I, on the one hand, absolutely loathe the deal that Boris brought back from the European Union a few weeks ago. It was Mrs May's deal, reheated. I didn't like it. I looked at areas like the separation of Northern Ireland. I looked at fisheries. I looked at which wouldn't bring back our waters. I looked at state aid rules, which would make it very difficult to help British steel or other strategic industries. I looked at the outstanding, let's see, of tens of billions of pounds that we have with the European Investment Bank. But above all, there were two things that really I found completely unacceptable. One was that it did not get Brexit done because the next phase of negotiations, the negotiation of a trade deal, is priced in to last for up to 3 years. And of course, who's to say that would not be extended too? And Monsieur Barnier, the reappointed negotiator from Brussels, has said, he says, the next phase will last for 3 years or more. At least 3 years is what he said. The other thing that I just could not abide was the concept of alignment, political and regulatory alignment with the European Union. Democrats would have won a lot of seats as a result of a perceived split in the Leave vote. And what I couldn't bear the thought of was the very idea that if there were 326 MPs in Parliament who were of that persuasion, SNP, Labour, Green, Plaid, Liberal Democrat, that we could finish up with a second referendum. A second referendum which would destroy our trust in democracy, damage investment into this country, and, crucially, they wouldn't give us a proper choice. Because it would be Remain against a form of Remain, indeed the current Labour policy. So I'm trying to weigh up, what do I do? What do I do? Do I fight these seats, knowing actually that the direction Boris is going in is not right, but knowing I could risk a majority bringing in a second referendum? What do I do? Last night, I was very pleased that Boris Johnson said on video very clearly that we will not extend beyond the end of 2020. Yeah, I know we heard it all before about the 31st of October. Come what may, do or die, would rather die in a ditch than extend. I know that. The second thing he said was more significant. What he said was, we will negotiate a free trade deal in line with a super Canada Plus arrangement with no political alignment. And that was joy to my ears, because ever since Mrs May's surrender speech in Florence a couple of years ago, we've not been trying to get a free trade deal, we've been trying to have a close and special political relationship with the European Union. So Boris Johnson last night did say the right things, and I reasoned, weighing this up, that on balance, the right thing to do was to say, okay, Boris, you've made those pledges, you stand on those pledges. I've got to find a way of keeping you honest to those pledges. So what I decided was, and I announced this morning, we will not stand in the seats where the Conservatives won in the 2017 general election, but we will stand against all the existing Labour MPs and the other Remainer parties. We will focus our effort into areas where we've got a serious chance of being a challenger to the incumbent Labour MP. And that is where our effort's going to go, because if we leave the Conservative Party to their own devices, they will let us down. Although at least they are now going to be standing, saying they're going to do the right thing, although one wonders about their genuine levels of conviction. What we need to do is to get people elected into the House of Commons to hold them to account, knowing, as they will, that if they let us down, we will take huge numbers of voters and support off them, just as Mrs May lost vast numbers of voters to us earlier on this year when I first founded the Brexit Party. The entire strategy can be summed up as putting country before party. And I think that, in the situation we're in, 3.5 years on from that referendum, 3.5 years of delay, 3.5 years of broken promises, 3.5 years of a Remainer Parliament, and I thought the prospect of 3 more years at least of negotiations with Monsieur Barnier. So Boris did at least, to some degree, put my mind at rest, but we must keep him to his promise. I have, as a result of what I've said today, clearly there are 1 or 2 people who put their names forward to be candidates for us, who've been working, putting their own money in, and I, of course, I'm sorry for them, but the overwhelming 90% majority of people involved with the Brexit Party say, do you know what, you've made the right decision. We've now got to focus on winning some of those Labour seats and keeping Boris Johnson honest. And in those Labour seats, in a sense, the pitch is quite straightforward. Labour said they would respect the result of the referendum. They did it during the referendum. They did it after the referendum. They did it in their 2017 general election manifesto. They have now completely turned their backs on all of that. They now want a second referendum with Remain against the form of Remain. They've also done something remarkable, because in that last manifesto, they said that free movement of people would end. Now the Labour Party conference wants to extend free movement to much of the rest of the world. And today, of all people, Michael Gove popped up from the Conservatives to say that they were the ones who would control immigration, despite the fact that in the last 3 manifestos, they've promised us they would reduce net migration to tens of thousands a year. They failed hopelessly, and they've now dropped it from this current manifesto pledge. So I think at all levels, we've got to keep the Westminster class, honest in terms of what they talk about, in terms of their pledges, and challenge them at every single inch of the way. I'm also very struck that one of the arguments that we raised in the European elections was about investment in the regions, that so many parts of the country had literally been left behind, a lot of money being spent in London on Crossrail and other projects, too little money being spent around the rest of the country. And that idea was so popular, allied to bringing the country into the 21st century, making sure that broadband was available to far more people than it currently is, making sure that even mobile phone connectivity worked in vast parts of the country. We were so successful in the European elections that now both the Conservative and Labour parties are talking about investment in the regions, and we've got to get MPs elected to some of these Labour seats that have literally been left behind and fight hard on behalf of people to make sure that we do get genuine, proper investment going into their areas. So there's every reason to think that because we have stood up and done the decent thing, and by the way, there's no deal being done, there's no negotiation, I don't expect the Conservatives to stand down in a single seat, because they're just not made like that. They think in tribal terms. What we have done in putting party before country is we've done the right thing. And I think there's a message out there that if you're a voter, say you're a Conservative voter in a Labour constituency, because you can see that what we've done in other parts of the country is actually a positive for getting Brexit in the right direction, I'm going to urge people to think. You may see national polling, and the Brexit Party tonight's on 11%, although up here in the north of England, it's much nearer 20%. But this is not actually about national polling. This is a seat-by-seat choice that voters have. And I would urge Conservative voters in areas where the Brexit Party is the main challenger to the Labour Party, lend us your vote for this election. And if Boris does the right thing, we'll support him. But if he doesn't, we'll keep him honest. So that's going to be a big part of the campaign as we go on from here over the course of the next few freezing weeks. At least that's if the North East tonight is anything to judge by. Now, one of the other areas, and this is the Brexit election, and I do think that what I've done today puts that back on the map. I do believe, too, what we've done today as a party is stop a second referendum from happening. And boy, there could be no more important thing than that. But the other big debate that Labour are leading on, that Labour talk about constantly, is the National Health Service. And I think we just need for a moment to think about some of the attack lines that Labour are coming out with and whether they actually hold true and whether they make sense. Because be in no doubt, we will contest this election talking about all the issues. I've talked already with you on the road about political reform. I've talked a bit about investment in the regions, but we are going to talk about the National Health Service. Of course we are. It is such an important part of people's lives. I'm personally very struck that one of the biggest problems we have is a population crisis. Nobody dares talk about it. They talk about lack of facilities, lack of services. Well, when the population's rising by 500,000 a year, is it any surprise? But I tell you what, you don't want to hear from me on this. Let's hear from Dr. David Bull. David, good evening. Welcome to On the Road.
Thank you very much.
For those that don't know, you should, but if you don't know, David has been a TV star for much of his life. John Craven's News Round,
Yes,
I
very
think.
good,
Yeah,
good.
long time ago. Sorry about that.
23 years ago.
Yeah, and then of course you've been on Sky News.
Yeah, I
as a-
did Watchdog with Anne Robinson, Watchdog Health Check, Tomorrow's World. So really fighting for health campaigns,
Yes.
improving the NHS for my entire adult life.
So David is our NHS spokesman, and we are not going to launch our national, not manifesto. Oh no. Manifesto equals lie. We're going to have a contract with the British people. But David, we're very, very pleased to have you on board with your huge experience in the health sector. And I just wanted to begin by talking a little about the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn. He seems to be claiming ownership of the NHS for the Labour Party just because they founded it.
Well, it's complete nonsense, isn't it? Of course, the NHS is something that's so dear to everyone's hearts. And when it works well, it's fantastic. I think many people would understand that. There are problems with the NHS, but also the NHS is something that we can hold up around the world. And the Labour Party does not own the NHS. It is owned by the people of this country. We all pay money into the NHS, and we must ensure it remains free at the point of need, which is absolutely crucial. And really, good healthcare is all about making sure the NHS has the resources it can or has to deliver that, but also making sure the management structures are efficient to deliver it.
Yeah, I mean, he also says that Trump, of course, is going to buy up the whole of the NHS, although the Donald told me on LBC himself that was now off the table completely. So let's discount that one for a moment. But the other one that fascinates me is they constantly say that the Tories and Nigel Farage would privatise the NHS. Isn't the truth of it, correct me if I'm wrong, that it was in fact a Labour government a few years ago that did privatise
Well, you may remember a certain Tony Blair was all in favour of the private companies coming in and actually taking off those services. So although the service remains free at the point of need, within that structure, private companies are paid to deliver services. That is what happens. And actually, I think one of the worst decisions ever was PFI, the Private Financial Initiative, which essentially was borrowing apparently free money to build hospitals that we're still paying for. And there are some apocryphal tales actually that when they were built, the architects who were building those hospitals had never really been to a hospital, so didn't really understand the way that the clinical flow of a hospital. So for example, there weren't enough basins to wash in, there weren't the doors weren't big enough to get the trolleys through and things like that. So in fact, actually, private provision has always been in the NHS, certainly since Tony Blair. Sometimes it's brilliant and other times it's not. So again, it's about ensuring that for me, as a medic, it's important that people feel they are getting fantastic care, and care which is free at the point of need.
Now, I've suggested in the past that those that can afford it should be encouraged to take out private insurance, maybe get a bit of tax relief on it, something like that, because it seemed to me that actually that might relieve whether it's 5 or 10% of the burden on the NHS. Is there anything objectionable about that point of view?
No, there isn't. The one thing that I do have a problem with is the private providers are using general practitioners as their triage service. So they're saying, we are not allowing you to have your tonsils done or whatever it is, or a boil taken off, unless you go to your GP and you get a letter. Now that, to me, is a terrible waste of GP's time. So I have no problem with private provision, but the NHS provision should be sacrosanct. So that should be, the NHS GP should be allowed to treat NHS patients. If you want for your waiting list to be shorter, then sure, pay privately, go private, get a nicer room, possibly a nicer lunch. So in fact, the two can and should work symbiotically. And also, for many of these hospitals, they rely on their private wings because that brings in revenue back into the NHS. So
which is no bad thing.
It's no bad thing, and it's a falsehood to say, as Corbyn does, we don't want private medicine at all. The NHS would collapse without that private income.
Now let's talk about the other 90%. When we put an extra £1 billion, for argument's sake, into the National Health Service, are we getting right now, in your view, objectively, bang for our buck?
No, not at all. Because, of course, the problem is that if you look back to the origins of the NHS, it was basically a centralised system, and it's been decentralised the whole time. And what you're starting to see, so you had individual hospital trusts, as you remember, and they're all now buying up other hospitals, and so forming these super trusts. So if you look at things like procurement, why is it that one hospital is buying a syringe that costs, say, 25p, but another hospital is buying it and it's £1.90? There's no central procurement. That's nonsensical.
So, but that's an argument for more centralisation.
It may be that I believe there are a number of things here, and we can talk about what we're going to launch. But essentially, I think there's a raft of managers that have come in. When I was a junior doctor, you know, all these managers started coming in, and I remember a lady coming in a very nice suit after I'd been on call for a weekend where I was covered in blood, you know, and I looked like I'd been pulled through a hedge. And she said, you know, doctors, your productivity is not high enough. We don't deal in productivity, we deal in people's lives. And I think one of the things that they really lost sight of was you need clinicians to be in charge of that patient flow. You need people who understand what is the actual cause of a heart attack. You know, people are different and individual. So whilst we need managers and accountants, I think actually we need more clinical experience pushed back into the front line.
Now, when I read statistics, I'm always, like you, dubious of all statistics, experts and all the rest of it.
Lies and
but, well, you know, and you can use them how you want, but I do see that in France, the numbers tell me that in terms of heart attack, stroke and cancer, the French people are getting a much better delivery from their health system than we are, and we're just separated by 22 miles. What's going on here?
Well, I think there's a number of things. One is that, of course, because the NHS is free, or seen to be free, there's no value proposition attached. So people here, and we were talking about this at lunch actually, I think people here are quite passive in this. So the doctor on high says, well, I think you need to do this, and the patient says, oh yes, doctor, and doesn't question it. You know, and actually this needs to be a relationship built together with the doctor and the patient. What they're very good at in France is they do use private provision, and they use it in a way that's slightly different to ours, but equally, so here in the northeast, I've just been looking up what's been going on here, and you know, the levels of social deprivation, the levels of alcoholism up here, the levels of mental health problems. So why are they not getting the support? And if you look at the funding isn't here either. So we need to completely redress the system.
Is this another sort of part of the regions being just forgotten about, ignored?
Completely.
The North East being taken for granted?
Yeah. I think
they all vote Labour anyway,
exactly.
Has been the assumption.
Yes, exactly. So, and also I'm a great believer that where you live should not determine when you die. And here, people in the North East are likely to die 7 years earlier than people who are in more metropolitan London. And you see, the problem is policy is dictated by London metropolitan elites, who don't really care very much for the North East.
So the NHS is not Corbyn's to own?
It's not Corbyn's, it's certainly not Boris Johnson's. And I think actually, going back to our mantra of changing politics for good, for me, this should be about saying, what do we as a country, as a nation want? How much do we cherish the NHS? How much are we willing to put in? And what services do you want it to provide? And no one, apart from us, is brave enough to do that.
And finally, David, it's a personal bugbear of mine. But I heard the Tories this week saying we're going to make it much easier for foreign doctors to come into the country, and I scratched my head. Then the next day they said we're going to train 500 doctors more a year. Why are we not training enough doctors and nurses? Why are we taking nurses from Mauritania and countries that need them better than we do? Why are we not training enough medical staff?
Well, I think there are a number of things that have gone wrong over the years. Firstly, I think medicine has become increasingly obsessed with academic grades when you leave school, so that all the families that want
degree for nursing, that kind of thing,
all that sort of thing, but particularly for doctors. So we've got a whole raft of kids who go into medical school because mummy and daddy think they should be doctors because it looks good, but actually they never ever qualify, or they may drop out early, or they qualify and then they leave. So we've got this huge hemorrhaging. But one of the other things is, why did all nurses need an academic qualification? Because when I'm ill, I want someone who has compassion, who cares, who holds my hand. And I don't think you need a degree to do that.
A whole load more to debate on the NHS, on many other policies, above all, of course, on Brexit. David, thank you for joining us on the road. And wouldn't it be nice if around the NHS we could actually have an honest, proper debate? I hope tonight we've started that. Thank you for joining us.